It's a great pleasure for me to introduce you to Mary Beard. Mary needs little introduction, described by The Guardian as Britain's best-known classicist, scholar of the ancient Roman world, Emerita Professor of Newnham College, Cambridge, and known to many, all of us indeed, for her books, SPQR, many other books, translated into 30 languages, her television programs on the classical world, Meet the Romans, Pompeii, Civilizations. Mary, thank you for coming to Clifton.
It's beautiful.
It's your first time, is that right?
It is the first time I've been here.
It's a great coup for us to have you here.
I'm going to make the most of it.
And it's testament to your immense popularity that this room is fuller than I've ever seen it, I think. And also testament to the popularity of the subject that we're going to discuss, the Roman world. And it's very much in the news at the moment, is it not?
Indeed it is. We've discovered over the last fortnight that some men think about the Roman Empire more than 3 times a day. And I kind of hinted that this might have been a publicity stunt for my new book, but my publishers assure me that they had nothing to do with it. But my answer to that is usually, I think about the Roman Empire all the time.
And the TikTok Roman Empire hashtag has been viewed 1.3 billion times. That's a lot of views.
And what I now say,
a lot of potential book sales.
If you really want to develop your interest in the Roman world beyond what I suspect is a slightly macho interest, I can give you a few good books to read. Sell you a few good books.
One in particular, which we're here to talk about today, is Emperor of Rome, which says on the back, a new way of seeing the Roman Empire. And it really is a new way of seeing the Roman Empire, which we'll go into in a second. I wanted to start, Mary, if I may, by just setting the scene of ancient Rome in terms of the timeline, so that we're all clear about what's going on. I mean, Rome, I studied classics at university. I'm a keen amateur, as it were, on the subject. And Rome, if one could be simplistic about it, was first kings, largely mythical kings, and then the 500-year period of this really miraculous system of government, the Roman Republic, during which Rome expanded, and then it fell apart. Will you tell us the story of what happened? Will you paint a picture of what was going on?
Yeah, I mean, Rome's image of its first period is that it was a monarchy, but the key period for the development of Rome, or for Rome becoming the Rome we know, is a period between about 500 BC and the assassination of Caesar in 44, when it was what I call in the book a sort of democracy. That's to say, it was actually dominated by a fairly close clique of oligarchs, but it was a power-sharing clique. And it was built on the principle that nobody should hold power for very long, and everybody should always share power when they had it. What then happened, and it's actually much more puzzling than the big question that people always ask, which is, why did the Roman Empire decline? What then happened is for reasons we still don't understand. They managed to be super successful in expanding Roman territory by fairly brutal means of conquest. I don't think they were any more brutal than the other people in their neighbourhood. They were just more successful at it. So the first point to kind of grasp about Rome, which I think is really confused by the vocabulary we use, which is Rome had an empire long before it had an emperor, that it was a democracy. It was a Roman democracy that established its empire. And the empire then ruined the democracy, essentially, because this democracy, this power-sharing arrangement, was really a kind of the sort of institutions that would govern perfectly satisfactorily a kind of bog-standard city-state in central Italy in the 4th century with about 25,000 people.
And we're talking about the consuls and the assemblies. And
consuls, the Senate, all the lists of magistrates. The top dogs being the consuls and ex-magistrates going into the Senate, and then another set of consuls comes the next year. It proved it proved brilliant, for, as I say, for reasons we don't quite understand, in acquiring an empire. It proved absolutely hopeless in the long run at governing an empire. They didn't have enough bodies, they didn't have a kind of long-term planning strategy. The consuls held office for only a year. It might take you 4 months to get to the other side of the Roman Empire. So what then happened was you get a series of kind of almost proto-emperors, people who get given power for maybe 2 years with power greater than the consuls. And there's a variety of shots at that until Julius Caesar comes along. And again, his motivations are unclear, but he ends up making himself utterly at variance with every kind of principle that the sort of democracy had. He became dictator forever. He was called Dictator Perpetuus, pretty close to a king. He was then assassinated by Brutus and Cassius and co. in the name of liberty. Now, Brutus and Cassius were a pretty nasty pair of thugs, actually, who have been hugely well served by William Shakespeare, who managed to turn them into virtuous patriots, because they held up their daggers, they killed Caesar, they said it's liberty. They were hopeless at forward planning, they didn't know what to do next. And pretty soon after, Brutus himself was issuing coins with his living head on the coins, which had been one of the symbols of Caesar's power grab. Long period of civil war, Brutus and Cassius killed or commit suicide, and out of this awful and messy period, the last guy standing is Julius Caesar's great-nephew, then called Octavian, changes his name to Augustus, who then steps into the shoes of Caesar and establishes a form of monarchy that lasted, well, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, lasted till the 15th century. In the West, it lasted till around the 5th century. He's a kind of absolute typical rebrander. He, like Brutus and Cassius, they were all thugs. He was a complete thug during the Civil War, tears people's eyes out with his bare hands, that kind of stuff. Comes to power on his own, quickly rebrands, changes his name to Augustus to give himself a kind of rather more senior statesman look. It's a pretty North Korean title in our terms. It means revered one. Yeah. And the rest is history, and that the system of one-man rule then continues, as I say, in the West for 5 centuries.
And the period of time covered in your book is the next 30 emperors, thereabouts?
Yeah, but
and
I
4 or 5 dynasties?
I sort of peter out. No, I choose to stop.
Yeah, because it dissolves into chaos.
You get a very, very big change in the middle of the 3rd century, when you have between Caesar and, let's say, 235, you've got about 30 emperors. People get cross with you when you say about. They say, well, don't you know how many, right? Was it 30 or 31? It depends on which temporary usurpers you choose to include in your total. So about 30 is a very precise way of putting it. When you get to 235, there is a big change. Again, the reasons are not entirely clear, but in the next half century, you have as many emperors again. Some of them never come to Rome, some of them rule only a few weeks, some of them are not from the elite class that all the earlier emperors had been. So, people used to say to me when I was an undergraduate, and it was Percipient, I think, look, if you went to sleep in 14 AD, let's say, and you woke up in 200 AD, you would have recognised the world. There would have been some changes, but you'd have thought, I'm still in the same place. If you'd woken up in 267, you'd have thought, where the hell am I?
So the period of time you're covering, not much changed in terms of...
Not much changed.
empire expansion in terms of the way the government, the machine of government worked,
that's,
the way the people behaved.
That's right. There are changes,
Yeah.
but certainly the emperors don't, I mean, the basic point here is that the emperors, one-man rulers, they don't form the empire. The empire, actually, in a geographical sense, produces the one-man rulers. And they do have, military valour still remains hugely important in kind of the Roman cultural ideology. But most of these guys do what a colleague of mine called vanity campaigns, which normally are pretty bloody, but don't get anywhere and are usually lost. The biggest conquest after 14 AD, which is the death of the first Emperor Augustus, is Britain, you know. And that was, you know, Rome, I call it Rome's Afghanistan, you know. It's just dreadful. So they're wanting to put themselves about as conquerors because that's what Romans do. But an awful lot of it is performance.
Yes. And what you've done, and there are very familiar names at the beginning of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. There's Augustus and Tiberius and Caligula and Nero. And then you get a handful of names that we are half aware of: Trajan, Adrian, Hadrian,
Marcus Aurelius, because of his damn meditations. Yeah, Marcus Aurelius outsells me, and I think I should be. I think I should be very pleased at that.
Yes.
But sometimes I find it a little hard to take.
Yes. bloody annoying. Now, what I love about your book, Mary, is you're not doing the traditional chronological history of the emperors, which has been done before many times. You're building the story around themes, around subject areas, and really what you're doing, I think extremely effectively and so interestingly, is telling us what it was like to be there, what it was like day to day. And although it's about the emperors at one level, what I found more interesting, in a way, even more interesting, was that it's about the people around them. It's about the courtiers, as we could call them, the people who worked around the government, the slaves, the women, all sorts of characters who come through this. Could you tell us a bit about how you discovered, how you found that process?
Well, I think I wanted to say, look, this isn't a biographical history, and I want to reassure you, in case this is worrying you about delving into the book, it doesn't matter a jot if you don't know the difference between Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius. You know, if you ever need to know, I'll explain it to you in the book. And the basic point, I think, is the Romans didn't know the difference between those guys either. And I copied, just for proof of that, I used a little photograph of a papyrus from Roman Egypt, in which someone who's clearly very learned, got very neat handwriting, is trying to make is making a list of the Roman emperors that came up to his time, and he gets them wrong, you know, and he gets them as wrong, or probably wronger than I would get, you know, if I tried to make a list of English kings, you know. But maybe there are people here who could tell us the dates of Edward III, but I couldn't, right? And
any takers?
And I think the point is, just let's, for a change, start to see these emperors as pretty much the same, rather than terribly different from each other. And then, as you say, Albert, you start to say, well, that gives me a different way into this. I want to know what they did, you know, who they slept with, what they ate, how they did the job, you know, when they got up in the morning, how did they travel, you know, how did they fix their successors. Then you start to see that, of course, you're into a whole community of power. You know, nobody ever actually rules alone. That is impossible. So you start to look at the slaves and the ex-slaves who wrote the letters, did the jobs, you know, carried the Empress's handbag, and I mean that quite literally. There's an Empress's handbag carrier.
Wasn't that Livia?
That was Livia's handbag. Sian Phillips's handbag carrier we're talking about there. Little tombstone just says he's a capsarius. Well, that's what it is. And so you can start to fill out a whole world of people at work, doing the job, living their lives in the palace. You know, there's probably in the palace in Rome itself, you know, there's a the posh lot are about 30, and there's probably about 3,000 slaves and ex-slaves. So I'm interested in them. But I think even perhaps more surprisingly is that through the lens of the emperor, you actually find all kinds of insights into ordinary people's problems in the Roman world, for the simple reason that the emperor, part of the branding of the emperor is that he's accessible. Now, this might be a bit mythologized, but the idea is, as in some, back to the medieval kings, as with some medieval kings here, the idea is that the poor, the destitute, they can take their problems to the emperor, they can write him their begging letter, and part of the role of being emperor is to solve the problems of your world.
And one finds quite trivial examples
Yes.
of cases brought from far afield and given directly to the emperor to solve, which I found very odd.
It is absolutely extraordinary because these decisions of the emperor, which he justifies, and somebody or the secretary writes down and explains what the problem was and what his answer was. They get often inscribed on stone, particularly if by the petitioner, if they got a good answer, or they're written down on papyrus, and you find them in Rome and Egypt. And they are, to us, trivial beyond belief. They clearly weren't trivial to the people who put these problems. One of the best is a case from Knidos in modern Turkey. It's clear from Augustus, because it comes to Augustus. It is clear that there's been some sort of kind of awful civic rivalry in Knidos between two families in particular. And one family kind of decides to bash up the house of the rival family at night. It's a bit of sort of bullying tactics. The family who are being bashed up get understandably fed up with this. And they tell their slave to go to the first floor and empty the contents of the chamber pot onto the head of the people who are being a nuisance, right? Which indeed the slave does, except he also drops the chamber pot on the head of somebody beneath and kills him, right? This is a terrible tragedy, right? The local authorities in Knidos think there's a murder charge here, murder charge of the owners of the slave. Right? But somehow, and we don't know quite what the process is of getting your case to Augustus, but somehow the defendants manage to bring the case to Augustus. Augustus goes through it, he describes what's happened, and then he says it's legitimate self-defense. Right. Yippee, happy ending for the defendants, and they then inscribe their version of the story in Augustus's decision and put it up in their hometown.
But a relatively minor manslaughter case in Turkey is taken all the way to Rome and decided by the top dog.
Absolutely,
yeah.
And
they can't have happened in every case.
One of the questions you have is, what is the filter mechanism?
Yeah.
And sometimes you strongly suspect that if you want to get your case to the emperor, it really helps to know someone who's friend of a slave in the palace, and that you can get fast-tracked. But not always. I think there's another, slightly unsavoury case that comes to Trajan of a guy who's been trying to make money by prostituting his wife. And then he's not paid. There's a client who doesn't pay, and he tries to get the money back by law unsuccessfully. He brings it to Trajan. And Trajan, who in some ways is a wise old bird, says, pull the other one, mate. If you do that with your wife, you deserve all you get, right?
And tell us about the day-to-day life was largely consisting of administration, of answering questions, of adjudicating, of solving problems from all over the place. And I was fascinated by the story of Pliny, who was governing a Black Sea province, and he'd have some fairly minor problem, and he'd send a letter which would take 2 months to arrive,
yes.
And 2 months to come back with an answer.
People have called it government by correspondence.
Yes.
And so there's Pliny out in Bithynia on the Black Sea coast. And he actually decided to publish, and we still have, his letters to and from Trajan, where, as you say, he's 2 months away. He sends a letter saying, I've got a really difficult problem with a bath building in my province, which was jerry-built. And could you please send out an architect? Right, so off that goes. 2 months later, Trajan replies, sometimes quite crossly, and says, haven't you got any architects in Bithynia that you can use? But that must have taken 4 months minimum, by which time Pliny must have decided what to, if the bath building really was falling down, waiting 4 months wasn't a great idea. And you sort of in that case suspect that Pliny is trying to cover his butt the whole time. I will ask the emperor. He's hoping that the emperor replies in broadly consistent way with what he actually did.
Yes.
But you can't, and it happens with Christians. The famous one of the earliest references to the Christians is Pliny writing from Bithynia to Trajan, saying, I've got this really, really irritating group in my province, and I don't know whether I should be prosecuting them and what I should be prosecuting them for, because they're really bloody nuisance. And Trajan writes back and says, just don't search them out. Just cool it.
They'll fizzle out.
It's not going to get big. This religion.
Catch on. This Christian thing.
It's not going to catch on.
Yeah.
So you kind of see that sort of sense of, the emperor is, or someone very close to him on his behalf, is at his desk. Now, I hope that doesn't sound boring, because we quite often like to think of the emperor as, having his genitals nibbled in the swimming pool and, all the other things. Tiberius, you got it right. Stabbing flies with his stylus, having kind of larger than life sex. And all that might be fitted in. I'm not saying that didn't happen, but you've really got to put back the idea that this is a man who either himself or those close to him are spending their time writing their letters. Marcus Aurelius and Julius Caesar, in fact, are so overcommitted that they go to the races and they take their letters with them to sign off. And it's a terrible bad look that people want them to write the letters, but they don't want them not to concentrate on popular entertainment. And you read comments the kind of comments you think you'd get if Prince William was found texting at the cup final.
Yeah.
Mind not on our sport.
Yeah,
right?
doing some admin.
Doing a bit of admin.
Yeah.
That's
yes.
right. Just imagine. And it's very much the same.
And so on this important subject of the violence and the sex, the image we have of from Robert Graves, probably mainly from I, Claudius, from the book, from the television adaptation, how true is that to when it comes to the facts, in your view?
I'm going to be very profound now and say we do not know.
Right.
We do not know.
Does Robert Graves give an accurate portrayal of the Julio-Claudian world?
Robert Graves gives a portrayal of the Julio-Claudian world, first Empress of Rome, that some Romans would recognise as part of their culture, right? The idea that Augustus's wife, Livia, that's the Charles Phillips character, managed to kind of implant her son Tiberius on the throne through poisoning everybody who stood in his way, was not a line invented by Robert Graves. It was reported, it was gossiped about in the ancient world itself. That doesn't make it true. And I think you have a big problem that Roman writers themselves recognised with information streams when you get power taken into the palace. One of the features of the sort of democracy that preceded this period, before Caesar, was that for better or worse, major decisions were taken in public. Under the empire, some of those still are, the Senate still meets, etc. But everybody was pretty savvily aware that major decisions were taken in the palace, behind closed walls, in private. Now, as soon as that happens, I think we know this very well from 10 Downing Street or the White House. What people are beginning to say is, well, why did he do that?
Yeah.
Who really made that decision? Why did that cock up happen? And it's, we know from our own world that it's, conspiracy theories flourish when it should be cock up theories. And the Romans were absolute masters at the conspiracy theory and never dreamt about cock-ups. And you can see, I think, and this is where the women come in, because I've got to get some women in, you can see that one of the explanatory models for what's happening inside is always the Livia character. It's the woman who's the power behind the throne, whether it's choosing the wallpaper or, whatever, And it's just to say, Carrie Johnson would recognise that there is a cherchez la femme. And,
and in a way,
you can't know.
So in a way, women come forward, are more prominent in this era than they were in the Republic, right?
They are
because they're close, because of their proximity to the emperor.
They are absolutely more prominent because we all know that when you have, quotes, one-man rule, the people who are really powerful are those who have the ear of the emperor. Why do you want to go to dinner with the emperor? Because you can bend his ear. The slave who shaves him in the morning can bend his ear. And more than anybody else, the women and the men who share his bed bend his ear. So you're right to suspect power has changed its location away from the elite senators elected to political office to the domestic environment. But you never quite know what they do. And it is... You live in a world, I think, in Rome where you can't know any more than, Harry and Meghan would be another example. I've been reading about how they're going to get a divorce. I mean, maybe they are, maybe they're not. But that's very much the same sort of gossip. And I think, just before anybody thinks I'm therefore trivialising it, I think the gossip is very important. Because I think the gossip is showing us how the Romans thought about how power worked. Now, that
important from a historical, from our
from a historical point of view,
yes.
And a lot of these anecdotes that are quirky, idiosyncratic, and we tend to say, oh, can't possibly have happened. All of these, or many of these, are absolutely brilliant lenses onto how Roman writers, perhaps people in the Roman street, thought about what might go on in the palace, thought about power, wondered about what sort of, what did corruption look like? Right, well, our kind of corruption doesn't tend to be poisoning. It tends to be fingers in the till or, back routes to contracts or whatever. Their kind of corruption rested in violent crime, actually, or non-violent crime, but murder nonetheless.
Which were the most depraved emperors? Which were the periods which you would least like to have been a member of the inner circle?
I don't think I'd ever have liked to be a member of a Roman inner circle. I think
Marcus Aurelius would have been okay, wouldn't it? No?
Well, absolute brute, in all kinds. Marcus Aurelius. Sorry, don't repeat this because I always get endless letters from would-be Stoics. Whenever I say Marcus Aurelius wasn't all he was cracked up to be, and say, Beard knows absolutely nothing about this, etc., etc.
She was jealous of his best-selling list.
Yes, she's just jealous because of the best-selling list. You can tell that left-wing scum she doesn't take Marcus Aurelius seriously. Marcus Aurelius, you go and look at Marcus Aurelius's column in Rome. It includes on it some of the most violent and horrible representations of Roman conflict, which Marcus Aurelius was responsible for. You see children being tugged away from their barbarian mums. I mean, it is horrible. I mean, Trajan's column looks all as if war's all about building and, infrastructure and bridges and this kind of. Marcus Aurelius's column is horrible. I think they're all awful, But I think that if I was going to recommend you to find at least an imagined excessive monster, I would go to Elagabalus in the early... Elagabalus.
He was pretty terrible.
He was written, I mean...
Is he the last one in your success?
He's the last but one. He's the last but one. 218 to 22. Or 214 to 218. See, I can't remember either. He's a Syrian teenager. He's assassinated when he's 18. He comes to the throne when he's 14. He is written up more colourfully, and by colourfully I mean nastily, than any other Roman emperor there is. And for me, I don't know what Syrian teenagers in the 3rd century get up to, you know. For me, it's not the question. The question isn't really, you know, did he do all this or didn't he? I'll give you some examples in a minute. It's that they open up a world of how you might, in the most gaudy terms, think about imperial excess. Sort of things Elagabalus does is invite his mates to dinner. And he's a generous kid, 17, and at the end of the dinner, he decides, as other emperors have done before, he will shower rose petals on his lucky guests, which he does, except he's so generous that there are so many rose petals that they smother and die, right? So at the end of the evening, it's death, right? Now,
by rose petal.
Death by rose petal, right? Absolutely. And I think there are many ways of taking that story. You know, you can say it's true, and if it's true, then it's, you know, it's what you get when you have a teenager on the throne, doesn't quite know when to stop. It's all a bit, you know, a bit of a kind of crass error. It goes with, in the accounts we have, him inventing whoopee cushions, which sounds very teenagery. And he sits his guests, makes them lie down on inflatable cushions, and during the evening, the slaves come round and pull the air out, let the air out, so they kind of end up on the floor eventually. And you know, you can see this is pranksterdom in the Imperial Palace. But I think underneath that, you know, that kind of anecdote is pointing at, you know, terrors about autocratic power. You know, and the rose petal story is partly saying to you, when emperors are as generous as they can possibly be, they are also deathly. You know, emperors kill by kindness. You can't trust a kind gesture from a one-man ruler. It always might rebound. And I think that that's the way I go with quite a lot of these stories. You know, that they are funny. You know, at a certain point, I thought, I'm going to write this book, and I'm not going to have any of those stories in. And I thought, well, there's not much left, you know. You know, and who's going to...
Just the admin.
You know, no one's going to buy a book just for the admin. And anyway, that can't be right. These are, you know, these stories are told and told again. Many of the same stories are told about different emperors. You know, it looks all terribly characterful and idiosyncratic, except that, you know, it gets told about more than one person. And actually, there's something in these stories, like in our celebrity gossip or whatever, where you're seeing what people think about power. And I hope that kind of running alongside in the book, this idea that, you know, there's the archaeology, you can still visit Nero's dining room, you can see the tombstones. You know, I went the other week to see the tombstone of Nero's nurse who buried him. We still have those kind of things. We're very close to emperors in some ways.
So when Gibbon describes the period between Nerva and Marcus Aurelius as being the pinnacle of human existence, as being the best time to be alive, you don't buy that?
I think it tells us more about Gibbon than it, you know, also, just imagine Totolite, that, you know, the best time to be alive ever, anywhere, you know. No, I think I rate Gibbon higher than I rate Marcus Aurelius. You'll be pleased to know. But it is, what Gibbon sees is two things, or he sees or doesn't see. He sees that over that period, you don't appear to have the kind of contested succession that you have in the I Claudius period.
Yeah.
And in part that's because the emperors at that period develop a strategy of using adult adoption to mask the difficulties of succession. They choose from their sort of wider family and have a clear idea of marking out who is going to be next. And that does seem to...
And that sort of work.
It seems to sort of work. The problem about saying anything about the 2nd century AD and that lot of, and Gibbon's emperors versus the I Claudius emperors is that the source material we have for the I Claudius emperors is much, much richer, more detailed, more kind of internal to the royal family.
What are those? What are the main sources?
The main sources would be Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars.
Yes.
Suetonius, the source of most of the early anecdotes, Domitian, Tiberius in the swimming pool, Domitian skewering flies and all that. That's told by Suetonius, who actually worked in the Imperial palace. He was a rather high-ranking elite non-slave official. He worked in the palace archives, the palace library, and the palace secretariat. So he was an insider. But there's Tacitus, who, in my view, I think, has a claim to be thought of as the most brilliant Western historian ever, but with a right chip on his shoulder about freedom, right? And his annals and his histories are the most cynical attempts to expose the downside of autocracy. And there is a historian going, in fact, over the whole period that I've been talking about, Cassius Dio, but he's a senator, he's writing much later. You don't get that immediacy, and also that drive to expose autocracy's faults for the later period that you do for the earlier period. And I think that makes a big difference. Tacitus is invested in hinting at, or more than hinting, that everything has gone to the bad with autocracy. Whereas you haven't got someone telling us the story of the 2nd century in that way. So we can fantasize that it was great. And Hadrian puts up a lot of buildings. And Gibbon, of course, he's not blaming him. He's an 18th century guy. I mean, he doesn't think about peasants in the fields, or it's a very elite-focused view.
And the lure of autocracy, which really is probably most colourful, most emblematic of the whole system, as seen through the lives of these emperors. What is it about its? I've got a few thoughts, but what is it about the allure of these characters?
I think it's about us thinking about ourselves projected onto a big screen.
Yes.
Isn't it? Isn't it? Partly we're saying, what would we do if we ruled the world? How would we behave?
Yes.
And there are extraordinary, and I suspect not entirely circumstantial parallels between what Romans say about how they think of their emperors and how we think of dictators, autocrats, or even, our more modest royals. And Elagabalus, again, is said both never to have worn the same pair of shoes twice. Now, that's the Imelda Marcos. What was found was supposed to be 3,000 pairs of shoes. It never was. Nobody has ever demonstrated these 3,000 pairs of shoes. But somehow, what the autocrat wears on their feet really strikes home. And so,
it's the draw of power without limitation, isn't it? We all come up against limitations in our behaviour, and What would it be like to have no barriers?
And we think of it, when you put it like that, we can't answer that. You know, we can't say, what would it be like to have power without any limitations? So what we do, and I think the Romans, just like us, they bring it down to specifics that you can get hold of, like shoes, or like how you treat your pets. Now, Elagabalus also was supposed to have fed his pet dogs foie gras. Now, you know, it's not very long since we had stories about the late Queen Elizabeth's dogs, and, you know, they were supposed to eat out of silver dishes. Now, I don't believe they did, actually, and indeed, I have evidence I have evidence they didn't, because I once went to film in a back corridor in Windsor Castle, and there was some nasty little plastic doggy bowls, and I thought, that isn't the silver dishes. But it's you have to find a way both of asking that big question, but finding something to answer it about. And often that comes right down to the domestic. You know, it's the shoes, it's what the pets eat, it's who you sleep with. You know, these guys were probably very boring in bed, you know, but not in our imagination.
But they didn't have bedrooms, which I was fascinated to learn about.
Yeah, I think no bedrooms.
They just slept wherever they just decided to. They slept on the sofa, as it were.
In our terms, they slept on the sofa. They have rooms in which they do private things called cubicula.
Right.
And that would have included, no doubt, sleeping, but it includes special chats with your mum. It includes plotting. When you go to make a plot, you go in cubiculum to do it. If you've got a very tricky legal case, you'll do it in cubiculo. And, you know, I think it's, you know, one of the ways, again, it's a very domestic way of imagining difference. You know, there's nothing more identifiable in a post-18th century European, particularly British house, whatever size, than the bedroom. You know, if you go around and, you know, you're buying a house and all the furniture's been removed, you still know which the bedroom is because the wallpaper's different, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, you have to entirely unthink that in Rome. The kind of, just as you would have to unthink it for, I suppose, pre-18th, or certainly pre-Tudor living arrangements here. You know, what you do in rooms is different. The way you define what a room is for is different. The way you recognise what it's for. And which is one of the reasons why when you go round, as you still can, you can tour around imperial palaces in Italy. You can go to Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli, and the Palatine Palace, and several others. You won't ever find a bedroom, and in fact you won't actually, despite some helpful and rather fantasising notices, you can't tell what the rooms are for unless they're dining rooms or lavatories or bath buildings. Dining rooms, you'll see the mark of the couches.
And surprisingly few kitchens.
You know, you go to the Palatine and you read all those accounts of what great meals they had, and no kitchen at all has been discovered.
So how do they do it? Takeaway?
Well, you might not be too far from the truth. One of the things you're worried about in any pre-modern palace is that the kitchens they're a fire hazard. So you kind of get them away. So they may just be a bit off-site.
Yes.
We Brits are terribly keen on our food being hot. You know, when we go to many Mediterranean countries, we're a bit disappointed that it comes out tepid. Well, I suspect that Romans were totally fine with tepid food.
And describe the Roman palace of the emperor. Was it how we might picture it from the movies, from television?
Now, I can be very clear about that. No, right? Absolutely no. I mean, we don't need a slide for you to, in your head, see the modern reconstruction of the Roman palace. It's large coloured slabs of marble, vast areas of arches and luxury. It's all terribly clean, and in most reconstructions it's got nothing in it. right? It's a sort of Marie Kondo aesthetic of minimalism. And there may be a few blokes in togas around, and it's rattling halls, right?
But togas were worn as rarely as dinner jackets.
Yes.
Did I read that?
I said
correctly?
that. Yeah,
Yes.
I think I'm quite confident I'm true. We think of what what the Romans wear, miss. They wore togas. Well, they wore togas about as often as we wear dinner jackets.
And what do they wear the rest of the time?
Tunics, coloured tunics.
Yeah.
Sometimes they wore trousers. Oh, how awful to think of it. So you've got this. What you have to do is you have to start with that image of the empty halls. Then you have to fill it with stuff. You have to have tapestries and hangings and lamps and furniture. You've got to put some sideboards in there. You've got to put some tables. You've got to put a load of people not wearing togas, and you've got to put all kinds of queer things. The Roman Imperial Palace, and there are many of them, but let's take the one on the Palatine, the Mission Control. It's a kind of cabinet of curiosities. People are sending things in to the emperor, and they're sometimes getting put on the sideboard and sometimes put in storage. One guy in the 2nd century has heard that the emperor's got a real-life centaur, that's half man, half horse, and wants to go and find it. And indeed, he does find it. And there's a very sad story because a prince of Arabia had found a centaur and thought, I'm going to send that to the Roman emperor. That's, kind of tribute. He sends it via the governor of Egypt for it to be kind of sent on. Sadly, the centaur dies in Egypt, and the governor thinks, oh, blimey, what the hell do I do now? So he has the centaur embalmed and then sent on as a mummy to the emperor. When this guy goes down looking for it, he does eventually find it. It's been put in the storeroom, kind of back corridor. And he says, it was a little bit smaller than I'd hoped. Right, so it's got that big, it wasn't a centaur. And he sort of implies it was quite smelly. Now, I think you have to multiply that by thousands. There are all these awful gifts.
Yeah.
And then there's the
rotting in the cellar.
Rotting in the cellar. And, there's cinnamon trees that have been brought in for the emperor's drug regime. And
so there's some hygiene levels, might have been leaving something pre-desired.
Just dreadful. And then and it's easy to blame poison.
Yeah.
When actually it's filthy.
Yeah.
And they've got their pets. Augustus, it is said, you don't imagine this when you see a statue of the Emperor Augustus, he never goes anywhere without his pet goat. And you think, really? Right?
Extraordinary.
And Alexander Severus, the emperor I end with, he's got 20,000 doves, right? In aviaries on the Palatine. God knows where they were.
Yeah.
But, shove all that back, say bye-bye to Marie Kondo, and shove all that stuff, and you've got the palace.
Now, Mary, we've got a few minutes left. I want to ask you a couple more questions, but will you prepare your questions, please, in the audience, and we'll come on to them in a second. Can you identify, when all is said and done, why this little Roman city-state became this dominating empire? Is there any one thing that made it?
I think
was that just an impossible question to answer?
I think that's the big puzzle, and I think it is, as I said before, I think it's much more of a puzzle than why the empire declined. Why they got it in the first place is what's really difficult.
And why was the autocracy its undoing?
Autocracy kept it going for a bit,
yes.
But then somehow kind of that slipped too. And those big questions about why you get this, why this? It's a bog standard, not very important city-state in a malarial region on the banks of the Tiber, and it gets to rule the world. And you can do various things. You can try ideas of, they are more systematically military. Well, they might be, but every culture at that point was systematically military. You can say they got lucky. I once said to a sociologist, is it all right, do you think, you're a very theoretical sociologist, I sometimes think that the Romans just got lucky. And he said, well, sometimes people do.
Yeah.
You know,
Things fall into place.
They just fall into place. I think the crucial thing for Rome is that as soon as it's conquered Italy, and quite how it does that is a problem, it ends up with insuperable manpower. I mean, so after it had conquered Italy, by the 3rd century CE, you could defeat Romans in a battle, but you could never win a war against them. Because if you defeat them in a battle, they've got the whole manpower of Italy that they can power in. So once it started, it becomes insuperable.
Yes.
But it still doesn't quite explain how it starts.
It acquired citizens who were bought into the Roman message, the Roman
it is an extraordinary.
manifesto.
I mean, the popular image of Rome is kind of, appalling, brutal empire. It's also one of the most generous, in inverted commas, states with citizenship ever, because they bring the Italians into Roman citizenship. That's what's crucial.
Surely that's part of the secret of its success.
It must be part, and that's why they can get them to fight for them. That's
give their lives to the Roman ideal.
because everybody's and they're profiting. Everybody's profiting by this, and that goes on. I mean, and if you want to say it's now largely forgotten, is there any one thing a Roman emperor did which must have changed the world? Well, I suppose you'd say 2-1-12, a rather unpleasant emperor called Caracalla. He gave every free person in the Roman Empire Roman citizenship. He gave millions of people citizenship, which made them, at that stage, not just all the Italians were in on the job, everybody in the Roman world had citizens' rights. Now, it perhaps wasn't it didn't lead to the kind of nirvana you might have hoped, but it was such a whopping change. For reasons we simply don't know.
No. Okay, questions? Right, one over here.
I apologize for this turn on.
I think it is now.
I apologize for a rather narrow question, but I'm fascinated by Octavian and Augustus. And I'm wondering if you agree that he was probably one of the most successful politicians and generals in history and survivor up until the very end, thanks to his wife.
Whether it's thanks to his wife or not, I don't know. I don't know if people heard of that. Is Augustus, who started out as this brutal thug, Octavian, doesn't he look like one of the most successful politicians in the world? And he survives 40 years. I think in retrospect, and partly at the time, he must have done. And he does transform himself with sheer genius, and again, we don't quite know how, from being a nasty combatant in one of the horriblest civil wars that there were, to being an elder statesman, a founding father, the founding father.
And at the age of 18, I think.
Well, he started out in the Civil War at the age of 18. He was closer to 30 when he actually became Augustus. Over 30 when he became Augustus. I mean, I think, again, the difficulty is I can't deny that. And I think part of what I think is exactly what you think. I think that there is a history written by the winners element here, like there is throughout Roman history. And there are clearly signs that Augustus's rule was messier and had more opposition in it than the retrospective account, largely written more than 100 years after his death, would ever let you think. That it looks as if Augustus, Octavian as he then was, arrives back, he's defeated Antony and Cleopatra, he lands in Italy, he's got a master plan, and he reforms the Roman state, making himself one-man ruler, but buying off various bits of the pre-existing regime. And to some extent that must be true, and to some extent that's what later writers thought. There's some strong sniffs that it was all a bit more improvised than that. But yes, he lasts 40 years. Blimey. No emperor ruled longer than the first one.
Any other questions? I can see one over there.
You talked a bit about representations of the empire, and I just wanted to ask you, are there any sort of films or television series, Rome, Gladiator, Domina, all that, Spartacus, that you think gives a reasonably decent representation of the way things really were?
I'm going to be a bit cheesy and say I think Gladiator wasn't bad in part. I think that, despite the presence of Marcus Aurelius,
He's really isn't he?
Always a blot on the landscape of the movie, I think, Marcus Aurelius. But there are some good bits. I think that Gladiator got Roman combat and its nastiness very well. This was not, those battle scenes at the beginning, this was not people going into, orderly formation with their testudines, their shields above their head. It was nasty and messy. I think also, although there were some things the matter with their representation of the Colosseum, I think the kind of gladiatorial combats that they staged in that movie, which were not just kind of two guys pointing swords at each other. They got some of the really weird, and for us, quite horrifying weirdness of it. Gladiatorial combat included, in some ways, well, it included people dressing up and being put to death as if they were mythical characters. There were, at the opening of the Colosseum, got a book of poetry celebrating its opening, and many of the gladiators or the fighters in the arena were criminals, and so it was in a sense execution. They were a man was put to death pretending that he was Hercules on his pyre, being burnt alive, and there was another one who they mimicked rather literally Prometheus having his liver chopped out, and I think that. That there is a bit of the seedier side, the really sadistic side in Gladiator that you don't see in sword and sandals movies. I should say that one thing they get wrong in Gladiator is they kind of present the audience at the Colosseum as going wild. Their bloodlust has been raised and they're kind of absolutely out of control. A colleague of mine has always said the Colosseum was much more like Covent Garden than it was a wrestling match. And they went in their togas, and that already tells you that this is a formal occasion.
It's a dinner jacket occasion.
It's a dinner jacket occasion.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what makes it really hard to understand.
Yeah, yeah. We're in the last minutes of the talk. Here's one over here.
Just if Marcus Aurelius is unfairly highlighted as providing wisdom to us today, is there any emperor who left sort of pearls of wisdom that have been missed or that it's overlooked?
Good question.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to go back to Marcus Aurelius and say the good side, I think, of him, because everybody concentrates on the Meditations. It has become the bestseller, and I won't stain them again. Much more interesting is the surviving letters from probably 30 years earlier by Marcus Aurelius between him and his tutor Fronto. And the letters of this young lad, aged 21, talking to Fronto about what he should learn, what he shouldn't learn, sitting down, telling us about sitting down with his mummy and having a chat on the sofa, talking about what hunting was like. Actually, I find more pearls of wisdom in Marcus's rather juvenile, sometimes slightly naive exchanges with his elderly tutor than I do in his meditations. So that's when I want to reconnect with Marcus Aurelius, I go to his letters between him and Fronto.
Question down here.
Just going off that exchange with his tutor, I wanted to ask a little bit more about how the emperors were educated, and how the boys who were born to be emperor rather than just became it by accident, but how their values were inculcated in them.
How were they educated? Well, that again is it's a bit of a black hole. We know the names of quite a lot of their tutors. So Nero is tutored by the philosopher Seneca. And we do see what Marcus Aurelius is learning with Fronto, and it is mostly the absolutely traditional stuff of Roman elite education in our terms, in all its uselessness. You know, an awful lot of it is, what am I going to do this week? Well, Fronto, I'm going to set you a piece of work to do. You're going to write a speech that defends a consul who has taken off his toga and has put on body armour and killed a lion and has then been prosecuted for demeaning his office. Right, this is a serious theme, says Fronto, give me a speech on it. Now, you know, it's very easy, I suppose, to knock other people's educational systems, and I think it would be, you know, we can imagine what, how are we educated to, you know, take part in the world? But it is really difficult. I mean, you can see that. You can't see how they're learning about the empire, about what it is to govern. They do some military service, but not very much. If I were to guess, I would say it's some of the ex-slaves in the palace, you know, on whom the buck stopped for getting the admin done, who took these kids under their wing. I mean, I can't see who else is doing it.
And Mary, I want to end on a question on education. In this world of STEM and technology, why should we encourage these young students to study the classics? What's the point of the classics these days? I
can answer that in various levels, but I want to answer it at the most general, at the highest, perhaps, level. You know, so this isn't going to be a paean of praise to Virgil or whatever. Though I should say, there has not been a day since 19 BC when someone, somewhere, hasn't been reading Virgil. That gives it a bit of a special cachet. However, I think what I'm going to say now would apply to classics, it would apply to history, it would apply to philosophy, many other of those humanities subjects. And I think we're very bad at saying, not what are they about, but what do they actually teach us to do? And if I were to summarise that, I would say that humanities teach us to argue cogently and responsibly and intelligently and with integrity about a series of questions to which there are no right answers. And if you say, what's democracy about? Democracy is about making serious decisions responsibly and with integrity in response to questions that don't have a right answer. So if we throw away our study of the humanities, whether it's classics or philosophy or whatever, we're in risk of losing democracy.
Cheers.